Hello, this is a fairly brief recording which is to try to sum up some of the event employment issues when we're looking at the labour market. So first of all, when we're looking at employment in events, there is direct employment. So this is where people are directly employed as event managers or in other aspects in terms of the delivery of events. But there's also a lot of indirect employment because the events sector actually stimulates other parts of the economy. So there are sectors that supply the events industry. So, obvious sectors would be things like food and drinks manufacturers, but there's other sectors that might supply technological materials, and that sort of thing. And they might provide, for instance, when you're setting up a big outdoor live event, you need things like toilets, you need barriers, there's all these kinds of things because there's a lot of indirect employment that you perhaps don't think about initially. And this all feeds into GVA, gross value added, which is basically this direct and indirect side of things. And generally we'll calculate this in terms of full-time equivalents. So what we're looking at really with the event sector is it is a really very diverse sector. So obviously you're hopefully training as events managers, but actually there's a wide variety of people who work in the events sector, and it actually includes some very unskilled workers, but also very highly skilled workers. So you'll also work alongside people who have a lot of technological skills, engineering type skills, who provide some of the technological services in the events sector. And I've already said events generate indirect employment, so there's lots of sort of knock-on employment. So in terms of a report which I've referenced for you, which was undertaken by Adam Blake from Bournemouth University, looking at the music tourism, there's something like 7.7 million music tourism trips, and this 1.4 billion spending by music tourists, so quite a high spend, and therefore quite a high GVA generated. And it's reckoned that the music tourism supports nearly 20,000 full-time equivalent jobs. So, that industry is quite significant. And obviously at the moment, at the present time, while that industry has very much been stymied by the global pandemic, you can see the impact that might be having from not having music tourism events. So other types of event issues, one of the problems in events is they don't happen all the time. They're not a day-to-day thing. They don't necessarily employ people on a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday basis. So you have quite a flexible labour needs, and this can be in terms of numeric flexibility, where basically you change the size of your workforce depending on whether you need them or not. So if you're not hosting so many weddings during the winter months in the hotel, you might not need so many staff to support that. So this is where we have this use of 0 hours contracts that I've mentioned, and also subcontractors. So where you use things like the gig economy workers, so people who are self-employed, who might come in and you might subcontract them to provide a particular specialist service to your event. And also there are people working part-time in that sector. So, this is quite a complex thing for an event manager to manage in terms of their labour needs and actually getting access to those. Because remember, one of the problems with 0 hours contracts is while you don't have to offer people on these contracts work, they don't have to take it either. So it is problematic, for instance, with football stadiums. And I know a student who did her final year dissertation on this because she was she worked for one, and they had this problem of securing labour at the weekends when they were running the football matches, and they needed a lot of staff in. And particularly things like they used a lot of local students, and when students went home at Christmas, they suddenly lost their labour market at a time which was quite busy for them, because they were not only still hosting football matches, but they were also using the venue for all sorts of other things like Christmas parties, and suddenly these staff weren't available. And then other issues are, it's quite important for you to understand government policy in relation to what kind of jobs are required by the economy. And the government quite often has used certainly particularly large-scale events to both stimulate the workforce and to also skill up the workforce. So, the classic example has been the London 2012 when we hosted the Olympic Games, but other major events like the Rugby World Cup, then that was hosted in the UK, had a similar kind of approach. And there with the Olympics 2012, they focused on, skilling people up in, for instance, things like communication, in things like organisational skills. So this was, an opportunity that they saw to actually try to generate those kinds of jobs. And also, the events sector can support, as I've mentioned, quite a lot of low-skilled jobs, where people don't necessarily have to have a lot of expertise or training. And also you might need to understand why wage levels in the events sector are at the levels they are. And they will vary around the UK. So it might be considerably cheaper to host business events in, say, the northeast of the country. And if you look at the events sector in the northeast, the biggest income driver for that part of the sector in the northeast of the country is from business events. And you will probably find that wage levels are lower in there compared to, say, London. So if you're looking to host large business events, then that might be the place to go. So it will be quite different. And I've shown you data on, say, unemployment, and you can see that there is unemployment in different regions of the UK. Now, that isn't necessarily where it's attractive to hold certain kinds of events, but there are interesting opportunities there in terms of actually there being people looking for work and the wage levels that they might take jobs at. And then there's looking at this relationship between the labour market and economic impact of the events. So events have been used by the government to stimulate the economy. Another Olympics example, but not related to the hosting of the Olympics in London, but instead the hosting of the sailing events in Weymouth. Now, Weymouth was chosen because, one, it was a great site from the point of view of the having the sailing, the sea, and the appropriate harbour to host these kinds of events in, but also it was an area with relatively high unemployment, and so therefore it was partly about stimulating the economy in Weymouth. And one of the things that is a very high profile event, it showcased what's known as the Jurassic Coast. So the Jurassic Coast is the coast that runs west of Bournemouth, throughout Dorset, and Weymouth is in the middle of that, and it showcased this beautiful coastline, which is very attractive for tourism, and therefore they were seeing it as an opportunity to attract international visitors, not just to come to that event, but to come subsequently after that event to actually see the place where it took place. So events have quite an important role in terms of stimulating the labour market in one form or another, because actually getting more visitors to places like London or to Weymouth post an event is quite important for that too, and would actually stimulate other parts of the labour market, not just the events sector. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of things, and we'll pick up this more in the seminar, which is on event employment issues.